you. So I'll just start that again. So welcome to the session. Today we're going to be looking at neurodivergent wellbeing, and we're going to look at some common experiences at work through a neurodivergent lens. So I'm Liz Mockle-Brewer. I work as a business psychologist and neurodiversity coach. Could we have the next slide, please, Maisie, if that's okay? Thank you. I also researched ADHD as part of my master's. So I looked at adult diagnoses and workplace disclosures in women, and got a ADHD diagnosis myself when I returned to university. And I can see myself having autistic and dyslexic traits from coaching so many neurodivergent people. So very passionate about this area. I also worked as a wellbeing manager before, and I noticed that wellbeing provision just didn't consider neurodiversity or the experience of neurodivergent employees at all. So there was a big gap there. And so the work that I do includes training and workshops. I work as a coach, and I also do workplace needs assessments. So I'll be coming at this from an angle of research, insights from my own experiences and through coaching, and also through sort of the lens of workplace needs assessments as well, and some considerations for workplaces. If I could get the next slide. So as you can see, we've got slides here. I'm going to be using Slido, which is anonymous and optional, so you don't have to take part, but I'd encourage discussion. If you want to put anything in the chat, cameras on or off, whatever your preference. If you want to come on mic and share, would be happy for that. And just being mindful of confidentiality, the session is being recorded, and so will be available to other people that aren't here today. And if the experiences aren't something you can relate to, just being curious to understand, respectful of others and non-judgmental would be great. If we could go on to the next slide. So Slido was testing me with the length of this code. So if you've not used Slido before, you can scan the QR code, which will take you to the first question, or you can join at slido.com, so on a web browser. And the code is 145-297-510511. And they're not usually that long, they're usually 6, so I don't know why it's really long. If we could just go on to the next slide, which should be the Slido. So has anyone been able to access that, and is it working?
Yeah, I've been able to access it, and it looks like it's working. I can test it if you want.
Because I can't. I'm just going to log on to it quickly just so I can see the responses. Would you mind just going back one, please? Maisie, thank you. Sorry, due to the technical side, I would normally have the slides and access to what's happening, but Maisie's doing the slides. Okay, so if we could go on to the next. Oh, thank you so much for putting the number in the chat. So the question was, what would you like to get out of this session? And anything that would be helpful for us to cover. I've got an agenda that we're going to cover, but it'd be really helpful to see if there's anything that anyone would like. So if you're able to, can't see the responses. Sorry about this. So would anyone like to share anything that would be helpful for them? Just while I'm just loading up side of mind, anything that would be helpful to cover today, or anything that you'd like to get out of the session? Just seeing if I can get it up. Okay. We can't see a question. Oh, it's asking us for questions. Oh, okay. Okay, we'll park that for now. So sorry about this. I'm not sure what's happening with the tech this end. But is there anything that would be helpful for us to cover today? Feel free to put it in the chat or come off mic. What does neurodivergent well-being mean to you? Why is it important?
I just put in the on the slido thing that I'd like to be able to better support my neurodivergent colleagues and ensure that my team can do the same. Just that we're being more inclusive in work and in the work we do with students as well.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to look at high level, what is neurodiversity? We're going to look at neurodiversity and mental health, co-occurrence, implications of that, and some of the stats around that. We're going to look at the neurodivergent nervous system and how that can impact us from a stress perspective. Also going to look at, sorry, Maisie, you've just taken the slide down, thank you. Neurodivergent stress bucket. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with the stress bucket, which looks at all the different stresses that we have and our different coping mechanisms. A few people have created neurodivergent stress buckets, which I think are really great because they consider the experience, which is quite different. Stress responses are different. So we're going to look at that. And also going to look at neurodivergent burnout, what that can look like, how people can experience that, the differences from traditional burnout, and then looking at the role of workplace adjustments and how that can support well-being. And then finally, wellness action plans. So I've just created a neurodivergent version of a wellness action plan that sort of looks around adjustments and support within the workplace and also some considerations that may impact. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So neurodiversity, we're all neurodiverse. So it's natural variations within human cognition and includes all of us. And there's this notion of a neurotypical brain, which is around societal expectations of what is deemed normal. And so those brains, the majority of brains would fit within a neurotypical context, and other people have neurodivergent brains. And so they may learn and process information differently. They may experience the world in a different way. And there's also that societal expectation. So what is considered by society to be normal functioning, they may experience that in a different way. And this will include things like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, PTSD, bipolar, and others. I'm mindful that mental health conditions sit within neurodivergent, so it's not just exclusively ADHD, autism, dyslexia, what we'd more commonly seen under the neurodiversity umbrella. If I could go into the next slide, please. Thank you. And so I work as an associate with Genius Within, who are a neurodiversity organisation, and they also take the view that mental health will sit within neurodiversity or neurodivergence, and also acquired neurodiversity. So brain injuries, things from car crashes, sporting events, you can actually acquire a neurodivergence. So it's quite a broad area, and we're really keen to focus on the strength. So it's not discounting what some of the challenges are, but these are just some of the great strengths that come with neurodivergent mind. So there's often lots of creativity and visual thinking. When you live in a world that isn't designed for you, sometimes you create ways of working and being to adjust and evolve. And there can be some really innovative ways. When I'm coaching people, I always notice some of the solutions they've created for themselves. They might have challenges at work, but they're always trying to find ways around that. And that often comes with high levels of resilience, just because you have to adapt constantly. So there's some real strengths that come with neurodivergent people, but also some challenges as well. If we could go to the next, thank you. So research is starting to understand more about the trait overlaps and the co-occurrence, and research by Birkbeck University, and there was 990 participants, and 53% of them considered them to have more than one neurotype. And so this is a picture by Do It Profiler. It's a bit of a screening tool, and you can look at the likelihood. It doesn't diagnose, but it gives you the likelihood of different traits. And this image just shows the trait overlaps. So there's often ADHD and dyslexia. There can be commonality, ADHD and autism, often Tourette's and ADHD. So there's often overlap between these different conditions. And so it's really important when considering the experience of people, not to focus on a diagnosis or not to put it into a box, because often there can be overlaps and there can be co-occurrences that happen. So 1 in 2 people with ADHD have dyslexia, 1 in 2 people with ADHD have dyspraxia, and 2 in 3 people with ADHD have autistic traits. And so the co-occurrence between ADHD and autism in the research is between 38 and 70%. So quite a broad range, but there's more awareness that there's definitely going to be co-occurrence for many people. Go to the next slide. Thank you. This is just from Instagram, and I really like it as a profile of experience. So it used to be thought that functioning was high or low, and we've moved away from that terminology, and it looks at support needs as opposed to functioning. But this can just show a profile of experience for someone, and this can vary within different contexts, different times, but it maps out this experience and how that can really vary across different areas. But also this isn't fixed, and this can be fluid and it can evolve. So again, if someone is experiencing something at work that's challenging, or something's happening outside of work that might be impacting them, it may not stay forever. So when it comes to adjustments, when you're looking to support people, it's always good to be flexible with those adjustments and to be checking in. Has anything changed? What's happening with you? How can we evolve adjustments and support? So this isn't a fixed state, and it does vary over time. Get the next slide, please. And so when thinking about neurodiversity and mental health, scientists don't fully understand the link between neurodiversity and mental health. They are aware that it exists, but the exact why is yet to be determined. There are some factors that may impact. So brain structures have been found to be different. So, for example, ADHD brains can be a smaller size, lower volume, and varying levels of functional activity. And so the size of that could have a bearing. Serotonin and dopamine production may play a role. Again, it's not fully understood how that works and how that might impact or interplay between neurodivergent conditions and mental health. There's environmental factors that may play a role. There's often genetic components. With ADHD, autism, dyslexia, they say between sort of 40 and 70% genetic link. So there's all sorts of things that can play a role in the co-occurrence of mental health. And also it can be situation specific. So social anxiety, performance anxiety, academic anxiety. So again, it might not be fixed or permanent, but there can be periods or situations where people will experience different mental health symptoms or conditions. So these stats here, the top line is relating to ADHD. So 38% of people with ADHD have been found to have a mood disorder, and 47% to have anxiety. I put the substance abuse one in there because the typical population is 5%. So you've got 3 times risk or percentage of substance abuse within ADHD. So that's something to be aware of when it comes to mental health and the implications of that. The bottom stats, the bottom 2, so 50% of autistic people are found to have anxiety, co-occurring anxiety. And this one I found quite interesting, 40% of lifetime depression. So it's not something that's gonna go away. It's going to be quite consistent. And so these are just some of the stats around the co-occurrence with mental health. And so having awareness of how that might impact people at work, it can impact executive functions, So when I do coaching, you can really see the impact when someone's struggling with their mental health. Their symptomology may be increased, their executive functioning may be more challenging. And that's things like planning, organization, working memory, task initiation. So when there's mental health challenges there alongside neurodiversity, it can really impact how they experience work and the world. And that final statistic was from Birkbeck's research. So the Centre for Neurodiversity, they found that the number one challenge for participants was looking after themselves mentally at work. So 77% found there was a real challenge with that in the workplace. Is there any questions or thoughts? I'll just pause there for a moment. Yes, hormones.
I was
Hormones.
going to say, Liz, we've had a few things shared in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you. So we'll go to the stress bucket exercise a bit later on, but thank you for commenting. And yeah, I think it's really important to look at the strengths, because we've gone from this heavily deficit focused modeled in research. When I was doing my research, it was talking about it being ADHD being a disease and a mental disorder, and you've gone from this just disordered language onto differences. And I think that's really important, not to downplay the strengths, the challenges, but to really acknowledge the strengths as well. But yeah, hormones play a really, really big role. And also suicide risk is heightened. So I would consider neurodiversity as a risk factor for suicide. You've got harrowing statistics around autism. 1% of the population are thought to be autistic, with 11% of suicides. So there's some really high prevalence. Suicide attempts in ADHD are very high. So there's this real risk factor around the implications of that as well. So we're just having a look at this. Yeah, the environmental needs play such a role. Thank you for sharing that. If we could move on to the next slide. So this is a little bit about the environment. So researchers again are starting to recognize the role that nervous system plays and how neurodivergent people experience the world. So you have their sensory sensitivities to light, sound, temperatures. When you're existing in a world and you're very sensitive to things like that, that can impact us. And they're starting to realize that the nervous system may be different for neurodivergent people. And so it's thought, well, researchers found that there's an overactive sympathetic and parasympathetic response. So sympathetic being fight or flight, and parasympathetic being rest and digest. And so you've got environmental triggers or factors that can really impact people and their nervous system. Research on autistic children found that their cortisol spikes were higher and lasted longer. So there's this heightened stress response as well. And the levels of stress experienced tend to be much higher. So you've got environmental factors that can impact stress, and then you've got this prolonged experience of stress. And also researchers found there to be lower vagal tone. We'll cover that in a little bit. So this means that there's less resilience to stress. So you've got a nervous system and a body sensing things, being aware of what's happening, being very responsive to threat. And so this can impact stress responses, the levels of stress that we experience. So it can be quite a different experience for neurodivergent people. If we go to the next slide. So there's something called the window of tolerance. And this is where we're at our calmest, we're at our best state, able to function, well-regulated. And it's thought that the neurodivergent nervous system is more responsive. And so it can flip between hypo and hyperarousal. So fight and flight, and rest and digest and freeze. And so it's thought that neurodivergent people have a smaller window of tolerance. So they can easily go between the different states. And also ADHDers have been found, they're more likely to struggle with hyperarousal, so freeze responses, this paralysis, getting stuck. It's something that I've experienced, and you're almost trapped in your body where you want to take action, but you just can't. And so this has been found to be an experience for ADHD. So there's this real systemic difference in experience that can happen. If I go to the next slide, please. And so the vagus nerve and vagal tone. So the vagus nerve is the largest nerve on the parasympathetic system. So that's rest and digest. And it's also the primary connector for between the mind and the body. So the brain gut axis. And again, researchers are starting to understand more around the role of gut microbiome and foods that we eat, things that can impact our gut and our mental health. And vagal tone directly links to the vagus nerve. And so when you've got high vagal tone, you're considered to have a more flexible nervous system. And the higher the vagal tone, the larger the window of tolerance. So that space where you are well regulated and you're not as responsive. And so there's a number of things that you can do. This was a bit of a game changer for me when I found out about the nervous system and the vagal tone. If we could just go on to the next slide, please, Maisie. There's a number of different things that you can do. So these all target the vagus nerve and improve vagal tone. So singing. So this activates vagal tone. The vagus nerve. You can do humming and chanting, but that can have a real positive impact. Breath work. So slow, deep breaths stimulates the vagus nerve and activates the parasympathetic mode. And so if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling activated, bringing yourself back to your breath and doing slow, deep breaths can be really helpful. Cold water. So this activates the vagus nerve and lowers the sympathetic fight or flight arousability. There are some people that probably shouldn't do cold, like ice baths and things like that. I think there's some impact for people that are either bipolar or on bipolar meds, but you've got to be a little bit careful with cold water therapy. But it does increase dopamine levels, I think up to 300%. So there's some real benefits of cold water therapy. A lot of people do wild swimming, I think it's called. And cold showers, ice baths, things like that. But that can really help with resetting your nervous system. Exercise, all sorts of exercise can stimulate vagus nerve and help tone it. Mindfulness and meditation, again, that can help calm your state, increase vagal tone. And then finally, prebiotics and omega-3. So there's really interesting research between omega-3 and ADHD symptomology and general mental health. So these can all play a role, really positive experiences around mental health, but also gut microbiome as well. So researchers found that gut bacteria can actually affect the vagus nerve signaling. So being mindful of what we're eating can really play a role. Just gonna have a look at music. Yes, 30 seconds of cold. And that's the thing, you don't need to be in the shower for ages on a really cold temperature. Just putting 20 to 30 seconds at the end can be really, really, really good. Yes, I agree with that. Hyperarousal. Yeah, there's this fluctuations between the states of fight and flight. Thank you. Okay, if we could go on to so this is the traditional, should we call it, the traditional stress bucket. And this looks at different coping mechanisms. So essentially you think about what are all the stressors that I'm experiencing, and then how do they fill up this stress bucket? Unhelpful coping mechanisms are thought to block the tap. So things like drinking, excessive alcohol, or any sort of numbing activities. I do it myself, a lot of scrolling on social media, and just they don't reduce stress. They can numb our emotions or make us feel a certain way, but they don't actually process or release the stress. So you've got those unhelpful coping mechanisms that are thought to block the taps, and then you've got helpful ones which help release the stress, essentially. And so this could be things like exercise, meditation, mindfulness, cold showers, things that we've discussed in the previous slide that can have a role. But what it doesn't really consider, this sort of more traditional stress bucket, is the different experiences that people have and what might impact their capability to hold stress, the size of their bucket, what other external factors might impact them. So if we could move on to the next slide. Some people just have the capacity to deal with more stress. Others are better at regulating, and there's quite a significant impact on executive functioning and stress. So that can impact our ability to get through with tasks, to be productive at work, to do basic functioning at times. And so this neurodivergent stress bucket, this is created by Amy Jane Needham. She's a forensic psychologist with a real interest in well-being. And so this is her bucket that she created, and it just considers the role of trauma, which I think is quite common, the different stresses that we can experience, and just looks at it from a slightly different angle. Just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on this. It also looks at, yeah, the emotional side of things. Does this relate to anyone at all? Yeah, they're just looking at the chat. Researchers are starting to become more aware of the role of physical health and the co-occurrence. I saw I didn't put it in this, but there was different health conditions and the commonality. I think it might have been in autism research, but there's definitely implications. There's, I always get it wrong, PMDD. I think that's what it is. There's overlap between that and ADHD and autism, PCOS, endometriosis. There's lots of hormonal overlap, as well as eating disorders and lots of other things. PMDD, thank you. I always get it wrong. But yeah, IBS, that's the one. Yeah, I've seen that one, IBS. And I think, I can't remember if it was Parkinson's or dementia, but there's a link. Alzheimer's, I think ADHD and Alzheimer's, they've found a link between likelihood of that. So there's something happening in the brain, clearly, that has that impact. If we could go on to the next slide. So if this is something that you would like to explore, thinking about what is the size of your bucket, this will vary from time to time, and our perceived ability to cope, and that's often what stress relates to. It's not necessarily the amount of stress, but how we think that we can deal with that, and that mental health, how much sleep we've had, our diet, all sorts of things can impact that. So just being aware of what is the size of your bucket, and how does that vary, and what are the main stresses for you? What are the big stresses in your life? And again, these will vary and fluctuate. Is there anything that you can do about them? Looking at helpful coping mechanisms, what are the best things that can do to really move you forward and de-stress, and thinking about any unhelpful coping mechanisms, often linked to there's often an emotional side to that. Is there anything that you could do differently? And how do you know when your bucket is getting too full? Yes, life is very stressful. I agree. Yeah, I've read about heart rate variability. I've also read around pain thresholds being different as well. there's all sorts of really interesting research, but it really is a very different life experience, I think, for many people. If we could go to the next slide, please. So neurodivergent burnout is probably a bit of a new concept. I looked at researching burnout a couple of years ago, and I wanted to look at burnout experiences for remote workers. And I just couldn't, when I was reading all the burnout research, I just couldn't really relate to the experience. It made sense, but it seemed much worse. And I've experienced probably 3 periods of burnout across my career where I haven't been able to work. So it's very debilitating. And it just didn't really make sense what was being said. And since then, research has actually progressed, and neurodivergent burnout hasn't been defined in academia. Autistic burnout has, and so it's thought to be a debilitating condition characterized by exhaustion, withdrawal, executive function problems, and reduced functioning. And so that's something that came from lived experience research. ADHD burnout, again, slightly different. Similar sort of that physical and emotional exhaustion, but it's this overwhelm, fatigue, and this sense of hopelessness and despair. So slight differences between them, but commonality across neurodivergent burnout is this chronic exhaustion, and I would often describe it sort of being beyond tired. You can barely do what you need to do. Sort of basic functioning can be really, really tricky. You can be really sensitive to environmental factors, to stimuli, so that sensitivity really increases, and executive functioning really starts to be impacted. And so for some people, they might struggle to speak, they might struggle to communicate, and it gets to that point of shutdown. So it's really quite debilitating and quite serious. Does anyone have anything they'd be happy to share about any experiences relating to burnout for them? Did you want to?
I'm happy to share something. I think somebody was speaking first, but couldn't hear them properly. But I'm happy to share something. I've shared things before. Some of the people I think in this group might have heard me. So I'll try and be brief. But I had what I think was my first experience of proper burnout. The first one that was kind of I now identify as being an autistic burnout in 2020. After being essentially made redundant by the university when my contract, which was going to be extended, then wasn't extended because of the pandemic. And I had 6 months of stress about how am I going to pay the mortgage, how am I going to, all that sort of stuff. Got a new job, and 6 months later, I crashed completely. Couldn't work. I've been fighting it for so long. Didn't know then I was autistic. Only learned 2 years after that, and I had another one. So I was in that role for a few years, and then the contract, for a couple of years, and the contract was coming to an end in that role. So I had to find another role again. Managed to get another job. 6 months later, bang, happened all over again. And I haven't recovered from the first one. And it basically means that my working memory is much poorer than it used to be. My ability to understand complex information is greatly reduced. My kind of tolerance for stimuli, particularly bright lights, sudden noises, heat, touch, the kind of sensory things that have probably always been there, but I was more able to tolerate them and find them much harder to tolerate. I'm much less adept at communicating with different types of people than I used. My masking kind of energy levels for masking is greatly reduced, and I haven't really been able to get out of that. Really since 2021. Actually, sorry, the first one happened in 2021 after losing my job in 2020, and I haven't really recovered, and I'm just kind of feel like I'm lurching from one burnout to the next. Now at least I know I'm autistic and I know some of the things behind it, but I haven't yet come across it. And I've tried certain things to try and help, but I haven't yet come up with a good way of making sure that I don't go into another one. So that's my experience.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And that can be common where these experiences do lead to diagnoses, or this was when I identified sort of autistic traits in myself, looking at autistic burnout and how I just couldn't function. It was, yeah, when I finished my master's, I couldn't talk for a week. It took so much out of me. I just shut myself away for a week in a room with no one around. It's just too much. The idea of even putting a sentence together was so great, but this can often result, the burnout can often point towards neurodivergence, and
Yeah,
um,
for me, my diagnosis came about by another route that I won't. Yeah, I don't need to go into that now. It'll take too long to explain. But it was after the first burnout that I was diagnosed, and then I started learning about it, learning about burnout, and I was like, oh right, that is what happened then. And I had the same thing. I was sat on my living room floor trying to work. I don't know why I was on the floor. I ended up on the floor. I was still trying to work at about 10 o'clock at night, and I've been really struggling to understand what I was trying to do, and I couldn't speak. And that was when I knew that I had to stop and take time off sick, because I couldn't talk to my wife to tell her what happened. I literally couldn't get the words out. Yeah. For
yeah,
me, I think I was always able to cope before with stresses. I mean, I've done a lot of things about this. I was able to cope with these stresses, and even, I was working at the same pay grade that I'm at now for quite a few years before I had any kind of burnout. What changed in my life, I think, was my son being born. And then I had responsibilities at home as well as at work. And so I didn't have that relaxing time at home, and I wasn't able to press at home after work and the weekend and so on. And that kind of changed everything, I think.
yeah, thank you. And just seeing someone just shared in the chat around the tolerance for normal things. Again, I don't know if there's longer term implications that once you have experienced this, or if there's been multiple experiences, that resilience has gone. I don't know if I will get back to being able to do things that I used to do before. And I know that's common with other people, but it can take years. And with sort of traditional burnout, I think it's sort of 3 months, 3 to 6 months full recovery. But it just seems to be very prolonged, of years of these cycles and never quite leaving it. So from a workplace, it's really important to think about what are the factors that might be impacting them, from job demands and things like that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just having a little look in the masking ability, that really, because it's so much, it takes up so much energy to be able to mask, so that is often a sign as well that it just drops. And yeah, it's very distinct. This, in the autistic research, they're saying it's very distinct from depression. It's a different experience, but there's similarities, but it's not the same. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts in the chat, and Matthew. So if we could go, so we'll just skip this because we sort of had that discussion just now. And so here are some ways that may help, and being mindful of where you're at and whether you need to be signed off work or seeking medical help. First place to start would be around looking at demands. What are the demands of you in all domains of life, and how can those be reduced? Is there any projects that you can step back from? Is there anything that you can start doing less of? And in particular, those things that are very draining, very exhausting. So looking at what are the things that impact you the most, and how can you start to reduce those. Doing a bit of an energy audit. And so this can be looking at your week ahead or your day, and you can color code the amount of energy that certain tasks take. So high energy tasks could be red, medium could be orange, and low energy green. And just start to see across your week how much energy you're spending, and is there anything you can do around those high demand roles? So this links in with the reducing the demands, but what are the high energy tasks that are draining you? Can someone else do them? Can they be pushed? Take a proactive role in managing your week and your workload. Something called the spoon theory, which looks at the physical or mental energy that someone has got available for daily tasks. And so this can vary from day to day. And so you can start your day assessing how many spoons do you think that you have today. You can allocate a certain number of spoons to different tasks and then work out what is my capacity for today and what am I able to achieve. And I think it's being realistic with what can be done and always trying to overestimate how much time and energy something might take, because it rarely takes less time. So just starting to be very mindful of your energy and how you're spending that. Being in nature, woods and water, has got some really interesting research on the benefits of stress reduction, and it just spending as much time in nature as possible can do us the world of good if it's a possibility. Thinking about communicating your needs, so to people around you, friends, family, work, who needs to know what's happening, and be explicit with saying what do you need right now, what can you have, what do you need some help with, and then looking at the nervous system regulation. So some of those other activities around cold water, meditation, mindfulness. Again, it may be too late for some of those, but if you're able to start using some of these in your weeks, that can have a real impact. And also thinking about the foundations of sleep, diet, exercise. Often people will talk about going back to basics. And so what are your core needs? What are the most important things for you to be able to function? And then start to put those into place. And just being mindful of what are the signs, what are the warning signs, what might you be experiencing, so you know that you might be going into a period of burnout, and can you mitigate that? What can you do to put in place before that starts to happen? If we could just, I think you go into the next. So I'm just having a look at the chat. Yeah, it is really different. I don't know if GPs understand about ADHD paralysis. I'm not sure that they have all the information to fully understand the experience. Oh, thank you for sharing the spoon theory post. That's really helpful. So workplace adjustments. So these are given essentially to reduce any disadvantage that may be faced due to disability. And neurodivergence isn't always considered a disability, but we would encourage people to assume that it will meet the criteria for disability. And it's about the impact of the environment as opposed to the diagnosis. So me going into work with an ADHD diagnosis doesn't guarantee that I'm disabled, but looking at my experience within the working environment, that is the assessment for disability. And so it's I can't think of the actual definition, but it's around 12 months sustained impact on day-to-day functioning. So having that criteria met, which is commonly met with neurodivergent conditions, and then thinking about the environment. So it was about the environment of the work and how that creates disadvantage. That's where the disability discrimination can come in. And this is research findings from the Birkbeck research. I'll send over full references to all of these that have been mentioned. And these are the top 8 adjustments that were requested. And so flexible schedule, and this is where people do their work. So flexibility with hours. Home working, being able to do their role partly from home. This was the second most popular and most requested adjustment. Having a private space, somewhere quiet, somewhere that they could do work when they were in the office, was the third. Dual screens, something that I need to get for myself. This was the fourth. And then being able to adjust noise and lighting. So thinking about those sensory considerations, they were 5 and 7. And then flexible policy around adjustments, around sickness, around all sorts of different areas. But just having that flexibility was really important. And then also having frequent breaks. So being able to take time away from screens, ensuring people taking their lunch breaks, those were the most popular adjustments. Yes, Lee, so important. Yeah, getting away from the screen. Been reading lots of research on the impact of screen time and emotional regulation. Unfortunately, most of the research is in children, not adults, but I think that has a real impact on neurodivergent people, and the amount of time that we spent on laptops and on phones, that can have a real impact on us. But essentially, workplace adjustments can reduce stress, they can help with executive functioning, which is a known challenge, and improve wellbeing and performance. And so, aside from the legal side relating to adjustments, it makes good business sense to be offering people adjustments so they can work at their best, they can perform. So it's something that all companies should be considering, really. If we could get the next slide, please. So these are just some common adjustments. So having meetings recorded, this can be really helpful when you need to be present, pay attention, listen to what's being said, and you know that you can go back and watch the meeting after. Having extended deadlines, this can be really helpful. Sometimes it can be a bit of a hindrance for others, but sometimes this can be really helpful. Having frequent check-ins and feedback, just to see how things are going, see if there's any help or support needed. Getting information ahead of time. So slides, I believe, were sent ahead of this session, but sending anything ahead of time can be really helpful so people can process the information, they can think of any questions, they can know what's happening, essentially, and that can really help with stress and uncertainty. Having agendas, so knowing exactly what we're going to be covering, what's happening here. Noise cancelling headphones can be really helpful for some people, particularly in really noisy environments or if they do need to work in the office. And there's a whole host of tech that can help. Lots of AI as well, which is really interesting around planning, organising, scheduling. So lots of tools there that can help. Admittedly, there is a slight stress when people are starting to implement the tech and start to use it. But once they get past that, that can be really helpful. Having clarity, clear expectations, clarity in communication, performance expectations, things like that. What needs to be done is really, really helpful. For some people, they can find prioritization quite tricky, so having a steer on that. And then workplace coaching is a common recommendation from workplace needs assessment. But all of these things, many of them won't cost at all. Some will come with cost, but they would benefit most people. And so when looking at neuro-inclusive processes and practices, it generally works for everyone. It will benefit all. And so, again, we'd always really encourage organisations to think about what they can do around their adjustments and making it as easy as possible for people to ask for them and to get them put into place. Okay, any thoughts of any adjustments that people may have had or have found helpful or might find helpful? Oh yeah, the loop. I've heard about those. I think I've got some actually. The loop earplugs. Nice. Yeah, so Loop's getting the thumbs up. So about yeah, I suppose it would be understanding, just looking at this question around balancing reasonable adjustments with equity, parity. They're not sort of they're not giving advantage, they're removing disadvantage adjustments. So coming from that position where you're not, it's often there can be resistance to sending interview questions ahead of time or anything that might prepare someone. It seemed to advantage them, but surely you would want to advantage people if possible so they could perform at their best. And so I think it's looking at what are the disadvantages that the person is experiencing, and why would you not want to offer something that could really help? I think it's quite hard to answer it without talking to the person to understand what they might think about it. So I suppose it's positioning it as their aim is to reduce disadvantage and to improve performance, and everyone would benefit. And are there any adjustments that all the team could have? So it's looking at how could you make the working processes better for everyone, I would say, but I'll have a ponder on that. Oh yeah, wearing a cap. Thank you for sharing that. Flexibility and moving deadlines. Yes. And with all the good intention in the world, sometimes you can't get everything done. Having things ahead of time. Oh, that's nice. The buffer between myself and difficult colleagues. Yes. And sometimes it's that emotional, that time where you just need to regulate, or before moving from one meeting to the next. I often find myself in back-to-back meetings and I don't have time to think or even check in to see how I am. So sometimes it's around the day planning and just having that ability to be able to do that. Thank you. If we could go on to the next slide, please, just conscious of time. So I'll whiz over this. So spiky profiles, neurodivergent people have spiky profiles, which is the degree of ease or difficulty to do certain tasks. And this is where adjustments will come in. So you'll look at what are the areas of challenge that they're experiencing. Can we strategize around it? So I do strategy coaching. So looking at ways to adapt the task or approach it differently. Or does this need an adjustment? So everyone will have a different profile of things that they find really easy and they're very good at. And the degree between the ease and difficulty is heightened, so it's greater within neurodivergent populations. And so we would consider those people to be specialist thinkers, so expertise, real talented skill set, very niche set of skills. And then other people can be just more generalists, so they can be very good at lots of things, but not exceptional at certain areas. And again, you would ideally be in a role where you weren't required to execute things that you find really, really tricky. So being mindful with hiring and job design on how that might impact certain people. If we could go on to next slide. And here are 3 questions that can be helpful to ask yourself to be aware of your own working style and preferences. And teams. So thinking about, what do you need? What are the conditions for you to do your best work? Think about the environment. What does that need to look like? How do you communicate best? Is it written? Is it verbal? Thinking about those communication preferences. And also, how do you receive and process information best? And we'll all have a different profile and we'll all have different ways of working. But just thinking about, how do you work at your best and how do your team work at your best can be really, really helpful. Go to the next one. And so this, I mentioned this at the start. So I've created just a bit of a neurodivergent wellness action plan that looks around adjustments and support and things that might be helpful, so I can get that sent round. It's based on the Mind's wellness action plan, which is around mental health considerations. But it can be used to communicate what your needs are, what support you might need, how you'd like to be dealt with if you are struggling, and signs that can mean that something is happening. And if we could go to the next. So are there any questions? I've whizzed through that bit quite quick. Just seeing this comment from Kai, and I think that's really fair around the undiagnosed, late diagnosed, misdiagnosed. You could probably assume that will be colleagues that haven't been diagnosed. They might not be able to. There's barriers to diagnosis, cost. It's predominantly based on white male presentation, so people don't always get diagnosed. And so there's would always encourage organisations not to require a diagnosis and to assume that if someone does self-identify, then that is likely. Thank you. Just sort of reading these. Yes, there's something around sickness triggers. That's what I would always encourage looking at. And again, not just for neurodiversity, for menopause, for all sorts of different conditions. What are the triggers for sickness, and how can those be adapted or adjusted as needed? And then we've got the other, Maisie, there's just the other signposting, but we will send this round so people can have it. Thank you. But this is the EAP. I'm a big fan of EAPs. I think they can be really helpful. They can help with so many different areas: debt, relationships, emotional, mental health. They can support and signpost onto other places as well. Thank you. And this is all the other support that you've got here. Thank you. Thank you for the participation, and sorry if I missed any of your comments.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for that presentation today. Thank you everyone as well for your patience with our technology changes. So we thank you everyone for joining. We moved on to Zoom from an accessibility point of view, which it is a better platform to use. So thank you everyone for joining. I've seen a few comments in there saying we're going to share the slides and the recording. Yes, we absolutely are. And you'll actually see that I'm logged into Kathy Bradley's her Zoom account. I found out very quickly today that my Zoom or my IT access is very limited. So Kathy's very kindly shared this with me. But thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I love that comment from Matthew around that. I think that mobility within organisations is so key, thinking about team dynamics and how can we make them both the most of skill sets and strengths. Yeah, it's so interesting. Thank you. But yeah, thank you so much for your engagement.